and welcome to the Scroll Sanity Podcast. I'm Carmella.
And I'm Nic. Coming up in a few minutes, we'll be talking to the co-founder of the Light Phone, Joe Hollier. Before we do that, Carmella, I wanted us to jump into our flows and friction segment and talk about the moments that are brought to us by our dumb phones.
Yeah, sure. So this weekend, I took a trip to the beach, which is about a 3-hour drive from my house. And this is a trip that we take fairly often in the summertime, but it was the first time that I did the trip without my smartphone. And it's something that has been like a point of contention with my husband because he's the one who drives. And he often has complained about how much time I spend distracted on my smartphone while he's driving. And he's like, you're not really there. You're not really here with me. And so even when I would put away my smartphone, it would still be in my mind. I would be thinking like, did somebody respond or what's going on? And and so this time I didn't have my smartphone with me and I didn't miss it. And I was able to spend that 3-hour road trip just like talking and connecting with my husband. And honestly, it was only thinking about the flows and frictions that I was like, but at the time it just didn't even bother me at all and it felt totally normal. And I know that that he probably appreciated it too.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, for me, it's been an interesting few weeks. I'm still very much finding my tech groove. As you know, I've been experimenting with this idea of really stripping all the tech down to its core components and being very intentional and use case driven. I was using really just an iPad as my main computing device. I like gaming, but the mobile gaming thing can be really addictive and there's costs associated with that. So I had a little handheld gaming system but it started to become less and less practical, I think. I edit this podcast, I write, I do some video editing, and doing those things on the iPad, the form factor just became a little clunky and it wasn't powerful enough for the editing. So I'm still exploring, what tools, what solutions are right for me in an age where I would have done a lot of these things quickly and maybe not as intentionally on the smartphone. What are the best purpose-driven tools for what are out there? And I'm excited to talk to Joe actually about his devices, his workflow in the day-to-day. But before we jump into that, I wanted to make sure we introduce Joe Hollier, who, for folks who may not know, Joe is the co-founder of the Light Phone. He studied at the School of Visual Arts, SVA, in New York City, has a multidisciplinary background in graphic design, video, typography, animation. He participated in an incubator sponsored by Google, which led to the launch of the Light Phone on Kickstarter, which went gangbusters when it launched. And the Light Phone, as many of the listeners of this podcast know, is a phone aimed at breaking the bonds that the smartphones have on its users with a minimalist alternative. The Light Phone 1 was focused solely on calls, and then with the launch of the Light Phone 2, which is a device that Carmella, you and I use today, focuses on calls and text, has some other functionality, but ultimately limits those other distractions. Joe in 2020 was named one of the top 10 most innovative consumer electronic companies for Light Phone by Fast Company. Joe, welcome to the Scroll Sanity Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. We are huge fans of the Light Phone, and I've been really loving learning more about you and your background in preparation for this interview. And so I was interested to learn that you were really into skateboarding, and then in high school, you and your friends created this skateboarding company, Five on That, which got you into art and design. And I'm guessing that it was sometime around this time that smartphones came onto the scene. So I was kind of curious, like, were you an early adopter or were you skeptical about smartphones from the beginning?
I was probably more of an early adopter, less so out of just like tech glorification, but I think needing a phone and practically comparing features, I really like the idea of having a camera, again, going back to skateboarding or art, being able to shoot reference photos if you're at a museum or if you saw a spot that maybe you wanted to go back to with your buddies to try a trick on, being able to kind of document. And I think at the time the App Store was pretty utility driven. You could get a tool to see if your painting was hung straight on the wall. You could, use some rudimentary maps that didn't even really have like live GPS. I don't think at the time, and as I recall, I don't think there was anything that vaguely resembled social media. So I kind of saw it as a tool. I had email on the go, but my relationship as a, 18-year-old to email was vastly different than it's become. I was selling some skateboards as our little company. And so being able to, do some of that on the go was nice. But realistically, kind of felt nothing like the what the smartphone became in a matter of years.
Right. And what changes did you start to notice in the world around you as smartphones became more ubiquitous?
I mean, it really has changed so many things, but I guess specifically being like a graphic design student and an artist at the time, the advent of social media, specifically something like Instagram, a visual platform, was really popular amongst me and my friends, even some of our teachers and whatnot. So it became this kind of pseudo portfolio platform where you could show off some of your process and things, but it really started to, kind of change the dynamic of how people viewed your art, or like, there was a kind of metric, like people almost felt like if you had more followers you must be a better artist, and it kind of flip-flopped the narrative. I'd see these like really famous graphic designers I looked up to with 150 followers, and then someone with 20,000 that's still a student and they're getting bigger jobs or something because of this. So that was like definitely one contingent, but I, just as a user found myself checking the phone much more than I'd like to admit, because it was there. You're in bed and you don't want to quite get up and brush your teeth yet, let me check the phone. Or you're on the beach and you go to change the song, and oh my god, I saw this email from some client and now I'm seeing red about some change they want, even though it's a Saturday and I'm nowhere
Mhm.
near a computer. So there's all sorts of little moments of personal friction that I found myself just feeling either like worse about myself, comparing myself, or just why did I check my email, I'm off.
Right.
And Joe, speaking of this idea of needing to be connected, I mean, running a telecommunications company with engineering and marketing and all the things that you're doing probably requires a lot of your time. But I wanted to step back to what you were just talking about as an artist. And I'm curious, I'm married to a fellow SVA grad. I know once an artist, always an artist. But as you transition from art school to inventor to entrepreneur, I think that's a compelling part of the Light Phone story. And I'm just curious how that background influenced the conception and ultimately the design and launch of the Light Phone.
Yeah, I think our maybe biggest strength or advantage as a company has been our design sensibility. My co-founder is also a designer of a kind of different breed, more human-centered design, which became really important in like user research and the actual product design. But I think what I was able to bring to the table was this kind of like storytelling lens from a very personal perspective. It was a problem I, wasn't, trying to empathize with someone else for. It was very personal to me, something I felt of a strong conviction about, and then trying to translate that through a brand. And, some of that is about not trying to make people feel guilty about their smartphone usage and kind of turning the narrative to like, we're all feeling this, you're
Right.
not some isolated addict that you should feel guilty. It's like there's, serious engineering power behind all these platforms that are, kind of using our vulnerabilities against us. And so, trying to lightheartedly, so to speak, like show that there could be another way. We didn't really reinvent the wheel with the light phone. Kai and I aren't super technical ourselves even. We kind of just took what already existed and repackaged it, rebranded it with a new intentional experience that really wasn't on the market. And to me, that's all design. Those are the kinds of things we'd be doing in college. An assignment I particularly remember was going to the hardware store, and we could each buy three things and we had to package them as something more than those three things through, making a kit and telling a story. Now you could see these three tools being sold in like Supreme or a museum or something. And, really they were just 99-cent hardware store purchases. But when you give it a story and, a context, it can mean much more to someone.
Well, and speaking of story and context, I think I was alluding at the top of the podcast to this idea that the multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerates that are out there sell us a story of convenience and empowerment. And I'm sure the three of us have seen really amazing art that's been created as a result of things like the iPhone or the iPad or whatever the case may be. So it's not that these tools aren't selling what they actually are able to accomplish, but I think it comes at a trade-off. It comes at a risk of falling down rabbit holes that steal your time. So, Joe, thinking as an artist, as an inventor, as an entrepreneur, is protecting creativity something that is important to you as an individual, and was it something that was a personal goal with the device in launching the light phone?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think making art in a vacuum is probably a problem, but if you're so oversaturated with trends or other things, comparing yourself and just seeing so much other things being made, it's probably harder to find your own voice than maybe it was before the advent of the smartphone. So, I think in college, the smartphones weren't fully ubiquitous, but the internet was this, oh, wow, we can look up posters from back in the day. We don't have to just trek up to the Midtown Library to see different typographic examples. But the other side, you're seeing so much other extra noise that is probably hindering creativity more than it was enabling it. And so there's that. There's also the kind of like ego associated with it. I think if your work is so constantly tied to like sharing it and then some metric of success that's arbitrary and, probably determined by an algorithm more so than the actual quality of the work, that
Right.
becomes this whole other kind of relationship where, since the light phone company, I've been able to, in a luxury way, like not share my work as much. And, obviously I want to be sharing and getting it out there again, but it's been a really nice thing to reflect and be like, why am I making this? And to really, if I'm not happy making it for myself with no eyes on it, then maybe I didn't want to be making it in the first place.
Mhm. Yeah, I've been noticing that with myself since I started using Substack. I've always said, I'm not addicted to social media because I don't really like post on Instagram or whatever. But now I'm finding like I'm more and more addicted to Substack because it's something that I'm engaging with. And once you start engaging with something, you start expecting that feedback. And so it's like, how many people, open my newsletter, whatever, like who's responding, who's liking it, like, and I always said, oh, Substack's different because it's long form. Or, it's like long form writing. It's not these like short tweets or whatever, but it's becoming something else. And they've added a lot of different features in terms of like notes, and notes is kind of like a Twitter feed. And I was really like against those changes, and I don't really use them, but I'm still seeing like my habits changing around it. So I was curious to learn that you started working on the Light phone in 2014, which is less than a decade after the iPhone launched. And today, people are much more on board with the idea that smartphones have a lot of negative side effects. But I don't think back then people were as aware. So, could you share a bit more about your thought process in creating this alternative to the smartphone?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. In 2014, the conversation about smartphones was very different. I think there was a wave of people that were just getting their first smartphone,
Right.
around that time. And they're like, what are you talking about? This thing is changing my life in amazing
Hmm.
ways. I can do this and do that and get directions. So there was definitely, some hesitation. And I always say that we had a very polarized reaction. Even amongst the tech world, we would be pitching the idea in this incubator to different thought leaders and stuff. And some people immediately resonated like, oh my God, I need this. Email's ruining my life. My kids don't look up at me at the dinner table. We're all on our
Hmm.
phones together. And then other people were, very bluntly like, this is the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Tech is moving this way. My entire portfolio is going this way. Like, who wants to go backwards?
Hmm.
So there was this kind of feeling that like the light phone was a step back. And I think now if it's much more obvious to people that the light phone's really just, one potential way forward. And it's not necessarily rejection of technology at large, but one way to carve out a more intentional relationship. And, even at the beginning when Nic was talking about how he's finding his tech groove, like all of our users kind of have a different tech groove.
What does your tech groove look like? Are you, I mean, do you have mobile devices in your life outside the light phone? I imagine, running a business, you need to be able to connect with people. So how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an evolving thing that I'm, somewhat experimenting with ongoing, but it's, you know, fairly simple. I mostly use a laptop for work. I have my light phone laptop, which I'm chatting with y'all right now on. And, it's very powerful. I can do email, I can edit videos, I can do all of these things. And so I have this work computer. And I think one of my favorite things is that email lives solely on this computer for me.
Hmm.
And there's this kind of act of like, okay, I'm opening the inbox and I physically open the laptop, and then at times I'm physically closing it. And I don't use another smartphone. I do have like an iPad that we got for the team that like sometimes if I do need to share a certain thing on Instagram, you can't do it all 100% from the computer, but I'm
Hmm.
able to do the vast majority of our social media through different platforms, like aggregate platforms on the computer. I'd say probably the most unique thing is that I did get a second computer that is like my light computer and that there's no light phone work on it. It's
Mm.
just my personal music collection or art projects I'm doing. I have like, Logic and Premiere and Photoshop and those things on it, but there's no email, there's no calendar. And so on the weekend, if I, want to look something up, sometimes I'm hesitant to open the work machine that might, pull me into 10 different things. And so I have that separation, which I understand is a luxury and probably unnecessary for most people. But being a pretty heavy artist on the computer, I found that to be a really nice, like, work life balance. And I think something else we, at Light Phone, we try to practice what we preach. And so
Hmm.
we do really, really respect people's off time. And I think we do a good job at clearly communicating like the urgency and the different ways to reach each other. If someone sends me an email at 6 p.m., it's sort of expected that I might not see it till the morning. Yeah, there's also a high likelihood I might see it at 8 p.m. and still be working or something. But if it's urgent and I'm out, I'm not worried about my emails because I know Eileen or Kaiway or one of our other team members, they'll escalate it appropriately.
Right.
And I think,
Yeah.
people have this fear that they need to be so on call, whether it's to their partner or to their job. And I think, a little bit of communication and boundary setting goes a long way because most people are super down to meet you where you want to be.
Yeah, similarly, I have an old laptop that's like, one of those ancient, super clunky ones. It has to be plugged in at all times because there's no battery life. And I pretend that it cannot connect to the internet, but like it can, but I just like pretend that that doesn't exist. And then that's the one that I use to do my creative writing, which is like my art. And then I have my other computer that's like my internet computer. So
Hmm.
I hear what you're saying, keeping like the art separate, and cuz I can't get my own creative work done if I have like access to the internet personally.
The distinction too around the output and what's the intention with that output, because I know for me, as someone
Mhm.
who does photo editing and video editing, if I'm doing it on the device that I'm going to be distributing it from, like the phone or the iPad, I'm probably rushing, I'm probably thinking about the audience response rather than the process and the work. Whereas if I'm on my video editing computer, which is, as Joe said, it's a little clunkier to share on social, it doesn't have the same features, I think I'm less likely to rush through it and think about that dopamine hit that
Mhm.
will come from the response and actually be more in tune with the piece that I'm working on. So I think there's a lot of value into separating that work life and personal life or art life, whatever, however you want to put it.
Totally. It's such a radical idea in this day and age to embrace friction and inconvenience when it comes to our devices, and so I'm curious what kinds of people are drawn to the light phone.
Yeah, I think initially my hypothesis and Kai's hypothesis was really just that it'd probably be people more or less like us between the
Mhm.
25 and 45-year-old age range, probably working pretty heavily on a computer, maybe freelancers who don't have as clear of an on off when it comes to clients and work and are looking for this way to be, a little bit more intentional with their studio practice or their weekend time away. But it's been kind of amazing to see it reach just like such a wider demographic, like to the point that it's almost hard to define because we see, a huge interest in like Bible Belt families buying this as, a kind of like we take our Sundays very seriously and we want this to be family time, or for their kids as a way to, kind of ease them into the world of technology without just giving them this, smartphone of infinite possibilities. We see organic celebrities all the time buying the phone who have, probably the luxury of a manager running
Mhm.
around with them and helping them, plan their days, find their cars. We've had college students taking out huge loans to focus on this thesis project and wanting to take that really seriously and finding themselves unable to focus if they have a smartphone around them, to
Mhm.
like outdoors crowd where people are like, I'm going to be in nature for 4 days. I want a small phone because every ounce counts. I
Hmm.
want a phone just in case, but like realistically, I don't want to be even vaguely tempted. I don't even want to look at a screen. And it's also a little bit less expensive. God forbid something were to happen or something like that. So we see some of that. And it's kind of amazing to see just the wide net of users. And obviously, it's still a rather niche thing amongst any of those one demographics, but it's inspiring that it seems to cross all sorts of like political lines or geographical lines in
Mhm.
a way that like maybe my art or other things don't seem to.
Talking about that this ideology that crosses demographics and belief systems, and as Carmela said, you've been working on this since 2014. That's 10 years that you've been in the light phone business. One of the things I said earlier is that I love the brand. I think it was one of the things that was most appealing to me right away, because as a marketer and a person who works on the messaging for these types of things, I feel a little jaded by all of what tech's been trying to sell us for the last decade. Your time is their money, as a sticker that came out of the box when I opened my light phone for the first time. It went right on my notebook because I thought it was awesome. Can you just talk a little bit about the idea of, from a messaging, from a values standpoint, what it's like to kind of take tech head on, especially given that, some of your investors are in that space. And as you said, their portfolios might be in opposition to that mindset. I'm curious. I think it's a brave position to take. So I'm just curious how you landed on it, and what it feels like to be doing it 10 years in.
Yeah, I think something Kai and I realized pretty early on in that Google program, learning from so many different founders and, investors that we chatted with, was the business models behind so many of these free smartphone apps, which, this is a little bit more obvious now, but I think at the time in 2014, most people didn't quite understand just to the level that we were being data mined and then sold ads, and that we were actually the product being sold to the customers, which were just advertisers or whatever other government agencies might want data or something. And so it's something that fundamentally, I guess, irked us in a way that we've not only like marketed against it, but like actually from a business standpoint, like our business is vastly different in that we
Mhm.
sell a product. There's no strings attached. It has a price tag. It's maybe not the cheapest phone in the world that you can get, but it's a phone that we're proud of, that we're not going to try to upsell you on next year. We're able to take user privacy seriously. We, in fact, don't want you to use the phone more. There's no services add on or anything like that. So it's just fundamentally different than the big tech business model. And then I think from a marketing standpoint, it's always just been about how can we explain this to people in a way that's not just incredibly depressing or overly technical and scary. And I think that little your time, their money is one that we're really proud of, because I think it's almost cartoony in how it's able to just plainly lay it out for people, and it hopefully can be something that sticks with them. And I think in general with our brand, it was always first about like educating in a way, or kind of bringing awareness. And if you never buy a light phone, maybe you see some of our things or our sticker, and maybe it just like makes you a little bit more aware of your own smartphone use, and like that's awesome to us too. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily always about just like selling phones, and maybe someone sees our things, starts to simplify their smartphone, and in a year they're like, I'm actually ready to take the plunge, or 2 years or 3 years even. And that's not
Mhm.
uncommon at all. It's
Mhm.
actually more uncommon for a spontaneous purchase of the light phone, because it's such a lifestyle change.
Right.
It took me a while to come around to it. I met a fellow parent in my neighborhood who I actually interviewed him about his light phone for, my newsletter, and then I was like, that sounds cool, but I can't do it. And so it was probably like almost a year, I think, before I was like, I really need to yeah, I felt ready.
Yeah, it
So
took me a couple years. That when I first looked at the Light Phone website, it was the Light Phone One, and I was thinking about it, and I had Joe. I'm exactly the customer you're talking about. I was trying the minimalizing apps and the apps that block your stuff, and I'm the great and powerful rationalizer. I can make any reason why I need to open the app for some reason, and it ultimately I needed to make that lifestyle shift to affect the change I wanted to see.
I think people are probably uncomfortable with this analogy, but the analogy of addiction, you hear alcoholics talk about how they can just have one drink on the weekends or whatever. And I've seen people talk about, I keep thinking I could just set these limits on my phone or whatever. And like truthfully, like behind, AA is just like, you can't drink if you're an alcoholic. You can't have access to alcohol. And that's how I feel about the smartphone. It's like, look, I know myself and I just can't, I don't have the wherewithal to control myself. And when I know how many engineers are behind it who are like studying my brain pathways. I don't feel like I'm a terrible person. I'm just like, look, I'm vulnerable to what they're, doing to me, and I don't want to be. So
And that's adult minds, right? This vulnerability that we're susceptible to, that we're talking about. And Carmela, I know you and I talked about that private school in New England that was moving students to a light phone.
yeah, I loved that concept. Like the whole school had their students switching to the light phone. And, this is a boarding school. So they said that the students were more engaged in their classes and had more face to face interactions. And Jonathan Haidt has been coming out a lot with his, he has a new book coming out and talking about phone free childhoods. And he's really saying there needs to be something done on a wider scale to lessen the social stigma of not having a smartphone or being on social media. So it's like a collective action problem. And do you have other examples of like a group of people that have undergone the dumb phone transition, and what kind of results did they have?
Yeah, I mean, the school was definitely beautiful experiment for us to see. It's a very
Mm.
particular situation, unfortunately doesn't seem fastly scalable. We've seen like some individual parents try to get their public school on board or a team of students, and there's always so many complications. One really inspiring group we saw, and they didn't actually use the light phone at all, but the New York Times did a really great feature of this group called like the Brooklyn Luddite Club or something, and I believe they're all high schoolers that switched to flip phones, and they met up and they just really embraced a different way. And I don't know, I guess I think back to when I was in high school and I thought I was punk or alternative for doing different things, and it feels almost inevitable that there would be some organic backlash, like students being like, everyone's on this, my mom's on Facebook, I don't want to be on Facebook or something.
Seeing it work at a scale like it did in that private school speaks to, as Carmela was just talking to, Jonathan Haidt's discussion around phone-free childhood seems critical. And Carmela and I are both parents to young kids, and it's something we talk about a lot because there's the risk of children feeling alienated by not being one of the crowd that has one. But I also think it's interesting, to your point, that the Brooklyn Light kids that maybe feel alternative or punk, it's speaking to that organic growth of this mindset, this ideology shifting. Joe, I did want to let you know, we did reach out to the community on Reddit, the light phone community, about having you on the show. We got tons of feedback from the community, that questions we're
Awesome.
going to share with you in a few minutes. As you can probably imagine, some of them are going to be about features and things that they want to see, because I know you get those a lot. But with that in mind, how do you balance the need for essential features with this philosophy of minimalism in the light phone's design?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Obviously, every time we introduce a new feature, there's some degree of backlash of, well, isn't this going to be a smartphone soon? But I think, we've set some really clear boundaries, both in the hardware and our software, that I think will keep it from ever being too heavy of a phone. I mean, the form factor itself, it's a very small e-ink screen. It's a slow screen. It's never going to do video. It's never going to have flashy colors. It's even for reading a long form book, which wouldn't even be as toxic, it's not a great form factor for. So I think we've set some of those limitations. And I think we see every upgrade as really just lessening the friction. There's inevitably going to be some friction transitioning and changing one's lifestyle, breaking an addiction, so to speak, because it really does feel like that for many of us. But, if having spell check or having copy and paste or having some of these other things that we've been able to add over the years that are, more utility based, we feel like that's not like taking away from the phone. You're not now going to be texting for 3 more hours a day, but it'll just be a little bit less frustrating when you do find yourself needing to send a text. And so, like some friction is actually good, but unnecessary friction, I guess, is what we're always trying to alleviate. And, adding the directions tool was probably like the most notable one, is I think there's so many people that really felt like that was too much of a jump. They become way too reliant on smartphone GPS navigation, even in their own hometowns. And it was actually kind of beautiful to see before the directions tool how people were self empowered when they actually realized they could get around, and that it's, we did this actually forever before
Mhm.
smartphones. But, having the directions tool, a lot of people were like, okay, now I can know that in a pinch, I can at least figure a way home. And, that's a rational thing. I don't think anyone's using the directions tool because they're waiting in line for the bathroom and they're bored. So
Right.
I think like those are kind of some of the lines we draw. And, we always say like there'll never be any infinite feed, any sort of, advertising based thing, an internet browser, or even email. And the way that we implement the tools, we try to do it as intentionally as possible. So you actually have to like set up the phone on the website ahead of the time. And so that if you are sitting and bored and, confronting your light phone's limitations, you can't actually even tinker with it if you wanted to. Be like, oh, I'm going to look up some podcasts or something. Like you have to make those choices ahead of time. And I think that all adds to the kind of intentional use that we hope to translate.
Well, as a user, I will thank you for the low refresh e-ink screen because I don't think I get more deep breaths in a day than when I'm trying to text on the light phone the way I used to text on my iPhone, which was just rapid fire. And then obviously the screen has to catch up. It sometimes I mistype because it's a small keyboard, and I literally take a deep breath and I start over and I type slow because it's not that important. It's not a 5-alarm fire, and I literally have gratitude for it because it's been such a mindset change for me. And with that, I wanted to move to our first listener question because, and I'm sure you knew this was coming. We want to know what's next for the Light Phone. That was a big one from the community. This first one was curious to know what features Joe thinks would be added to the phone in the future, and are there any upcoming projects or developments he can share with us?
Yeah, so we do have a new software update coming. Next week is the tentative goal. And
Awesome.
well, in early April, whenever this will air.
Yeah.
And that will introduce the timer tool. So we are bringing a new feature, but I would say that a lot of our current work has been in the vein of optimization and reliability. So we actually rewrote a lot of the back end for the ringer, like how notifications are handled, like, muting things and whatnot. And I think that's going to be much more reliable and also just a little bit more clear. We've added a lot of shortcuts to the phone. So, like being able to quickly click in and change your Bluetooth or get to settings, or now even on the ringer, you can get to the notification settings from that screen. Or we just added a shortcut for the timer and alarm. So, if you do have one set, you can just click that and jump right to that tool. So, things that, really try to ease friction and just make it feel like a more polished experience, in addition to new features like the timer tool. And other ones will continue to roll out. I think it's this kind of balance of, we want to obviously introduce new features, but we want to make sure everything that's there works as well as it can.
Right. Right. And is there anything to announce beyond that? I know there's rumors of a third phone. There's people asking about it. Anything you can share yet, or is it too early?
We're not really sharing much. I mean, I think it's relatively known amongst the community that we are exploring always alternative models.
Cool.
And that can mean a variety of different things. I don't want to lead anyone in
Yes,
two
not a
directive
confirmation,
ways.
but not a denial.
But I guess I would just say that like any new product we make, we wouldn't necessarily see it as a direct replacement of the Light Phone 2. I think if we're going to make a new phone, it has to be justified by its
Mm,
differences enough, whatever that might mean, that, the Light Phone 2 still has its place, and whatever other product would solve a slightly different user's needs, whether that's form factor or, actual compatibility with the region or some of these other technical things. But anything we do is going to be a light phone. And, there's only so much a light phone needs to do. And we're
right.
pretty proud that the Light Phone 2 hasn't had a refresh in so long. I know some people are hesitant to buy a product that's already been in the market for over 4 years. But to us, we're actually, quite proud that we were able to future proof it that much.
Well, and by contrast, seeing the same glass slab smartphones that come out every 8 months that are iterative improvements but seem to cost $1,200 a pop, I think you're absolutely right about that. Just jumping to our next listener question. This one is: I am a firm believer in multi-factor authentication and take a lot of consideration into my online privacy. I don't like using SMS for multi-factor or private conversations. Is there any way that a two-factor authentication tool could be implemented? Please and thank you.
Yeah, I think it's definitely on our short list of future tools. I can't say it's immediately on our like radar timeline, but there's only really a few tools that we've kind of been playing with left. And we use actually user surveys a lot to help us prioritize those. But I
Mhm.
totally agree that a 2FA tool seems in line, and I can't see that as a distraction in any way. It's always just a matter of our super small team and what we have to prioritize what's going to be the biggest win for the most users at each turn.
Right. And this next question, it's actually something Carmella and I talked about as we were reviewing all the questions we received, because both of us don't feel that the battery on the light phone is anything prohibitive by any means. But this question said its performance, the battery performance is unfortunately to the extent that I consider giving my light phone up weekly, which I know is a tough one to maybe hear. But curious, is that feedback that you get? Is it something you're aware of or working on? Or what are your thoughts around the battery for the light phone?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're at a little bit of a, you know, standstill in terms of physics. Our battery is X big, and it
Right.
takes so much battery to have an active cell phone signal
Connection.
listening.
Right.
And so that's actually the biggest culprit. And, people will experience pretty vastly different battery life experiences depending on the quality of their cell signal. And that probably is more exaggerated on the light phone because you're not wasting battery watching YouTube videos or something else where you expect it to drain. It's just sort of on standby. And, we've seen even in New York, some carriers outperform other carriers pretty heavily in terms of battery use. And then going elsewhere, that might shift a little bit. We're always open to optimizing the battery, but realistically, there's probably not a ton that can be done in the software anymore that would be any significant win. Obviously we can keep getting little small wins, but I wouldn't want someone to think that like the battery life is going to magically double.
Right.
So that's something we do hear about. I would say it tends to be a split. Like some users are like, oh, it's totally fine battery life. And other users, it becomes, a serious point of contention, reasonably so. I think I'm probably lucky that I tend to have charging ports everywhere, and I, don't even have a regimented charging schedule. I just kind of, if I'm at home, I might plug it in, or if I'm at the desk, I might plug it in.
Mhm.
And I never tend to really have too much of a problem with battery life. But that's something, in thinking of alternative models, like if there was a bigger phone, we could have a bigger battery, and that might be something that some users would want to trade off a larger form factor for a bigger battery or something.
Sure. And like with any device, I think with the light phone too, keep your hotspot turned off, keep your Bluetooth off, keep your Wi-Fi off if you're not using them, because those connections also draw battery, right?
Yeah. But I would say the cell is definitely the biggest, and
The biggest culprit.
obviously that's, essential if you were actually using this as a phone, which
Hmm.
is the intended purpose.
The next question here is about, actually, it's a comment. It was someone who said, the customer support at Lightphone can't be better. All of them are beautiful. Just want to share the love for everyone at Team
Oh,
LP. I just wanted to
oh,
ask you, how does it feel to hear that 10 years in?
I mean, it feels good, I guess. Really good. We're a super, super small team. And so, I'm very deep in the customer service as well. And it can be a really taxing role. You know, Unfortunately, I think consumers, we've been kind of trained to come in really hot and angry to get what we want. And so sometimes you're like, oh, wow, these people are really upset. But, I think if you answer them in a human way and not just some copy and pasted da 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 and actually hear where they're coming from, even if you don't have good news, I feel like people respect that. And so our attitude has always just been like, how would we want a company to treat us? It's not as easy to scale per se.
Right.
And we do actually want to even further improve our customer support. I think, we'd love to have phone support. I think that makes a lot of sense for the light phone. It's just really been a resourcing and capacity issue. But like it is, our users are amazing. Like we hear such positive things in the inbox. Obviously, when someone's really struggling or really hates it, or you know very frustrated with the experience, those can really weigh on you harder than all the really positive notes. But we have a shared channel where we kind of put in shared notes, so I'll be sure to mention this there. And if you're having a tough day, it's great to look there. If you're struggling with a bug as one of our developers or something, to be like, there's people out there that are so appreciative of every little feature we add.
Yeah, and I want to echo that sentiment. I had some buggy issues when I first got my phone, and your team was amazing. And at one point, I think I said, "Oh, tell Joe we said hi," and you said, "This is Joe answering this email." And I just said, "Wow, there's not many tech companies where the co-founder is dealing with customer support." So, kudos to your team for doing all that amazing work.
But it's also, I think, important to not be like in an ivory tower. Like, what is the pulse of our users right now? And making sure I'm aware of the frustrations and anything going on wrong, etc., and not just like, oh yeah, deal with that. It's okay. Because I think, that's how we improve the phone, even if it's, some days more taxing than others.
Right.
Absolutely. So, I think as a final question, in a world that's relying increasingly on the notion that everyone has a smartphone in their pocket, do you think that those of us interested in digital minimalism will be able to stay the course?
I mean, we're definitely fighting to keep one or a viable alternative. And I think that's why we're always really welcoming of any potential competition in the space, other phones or form factors or things that might come. Because, yeah, I think there is a fear that like our QR code's going to be so ubiquitous that like you can't actually do anything without a smartphone. But I'm fairly confident that there's still going to be alternatives for a variety of reasons because not everyone can use a smartphone. There's handicaps, and obviously smartphones aren't cheap always. And so I'd like to imagine that there's always a room. And our attitude is that like if we grow enough, then there's plenty of users that it's worth supporting alternatives for. And so I'd like to think that there is a way forward where digital minimalism is an option and that we're not just all coerced into smartphones because it makes life so much easier. But undeniably, there is friction even today, especially over the pandemic with not having a smartphone.
And that's something that I wrote about this week on my Substack. It's something I'm calling the dumb phone tax, where I wasn't able to pay for parking because I didn't have, the app. And the parking attendant was very confused. He's like, "You don't need the app, just go to the website." And I'm like, "I don't have access to the internet." But I was like, well, I might get a parking ticket. And like, that's the price that I have to pay for this other thing that I'm getting, which is mindfulness and more human connection. And, you know, in the end, I didn't get that parking ticket, but I'm just like, that is a price that I'm willing to pay so that I'm not like suffering from smartphone addiction like I was before.
And Joe, I just want to thank you truly. Carmella and I have on other episodes have talked about how I'm a better dad because of the light phone. I'm a better husband because of the light phone. I'm more creative. I'm less anxious. I'm more present in my life and in my body than I ever was. So I know it's probably been a long 10 years, a long road. And you said there's been some long days and hard days. And I just want you to know that my daughter thanks you and I thank you.
That means so much to hear. Thank you. And I don't know, we always say that like the light phone doesn't change people's lives, they change their lives. It's just maybe a little catalyst in one aspect, but it's really amazing to see the way people's lives have changed.
Thank you, Joe, for being on the show today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Talking to inventors, artists, engineers, and dumb phone pioneers like Joe is something we're going to keep doing going forward. So make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode.
Thank you, Joe. And please thank the whole Light Phone team for everything that you all do.
I'll definitely let them all know. Thank you.
Thank you.